The envelope was already open when Lena found it on her desk. Not her desk. The desk she had been using for 11 months without a nameplate, without a chair that didn't wobble, without a single person in the Aldgate and Fitch accounting office asking her anything except where the printer paper was kept. The envelope had her name on it, her full name, which surprised her, because most people here still called her the temp. Lena Vasquez, effective immediately. She read it twice. Then she read the part about the severance, 2 weeks, which was generous for someone they'd never technically hired. And she set the letter down on the wobbling desk and looked out the window at the parking structure across the street and thought, okay, not this can't be happening. Not how could they do this. Just okay, the way you say it when something bad happens that you had already, somewhere deep and tired, been expecting. She was 31 years old. She had $214 in her checking account, a studio apartment with a radiator that made sounds like a man dying slowly, and a mother in Tucson who had stopped asking when Lena was going to figure her life out because she'd given up expecting an answer. Lena was good at numbers. She was good at finding where money went when people didn't want it found. She was good at sitting very still in rooms where she wasn't wanted and doing her work anyway. None of that had mattered here. She packed her things into a tote bag. There wasn't much. A phone charger, a cardigan she kept for the aggressive air conditioning, a notepad with nothing personal in it, just columns of figures she'd been cross-referencing for a project that would now be handed to someone else. The woman at the front desk didn't look up when Lena walked past. The elevator doors opened immediately, like even the building wanted her gone. Outside, it was the kind of grey November afternoon that felt like a physical weight. Lena stood on the sidewalk and calculated. Rent was due in 9 days. She had a second interview scheduled for Thursday with a mid-size logistics firm in Midtown, but second interviews were not paychecks, and paychecks were not rent. She had a laptop, a working knowledge of 4 accounting software systems, and the specific kind of pride that kept her from calling her mother, which meant she was, by most reasonable measures, alone. She started walking because standing still made it worse. She had walked 4 blocks when she turned a corner and walked directly into a man coming the other direction. He was large. That was the first thing. Not in a soft way, in the way of something built for a specific purpose, where every part of him suggested that purpose had involved being difficult to move. He was wearing a coat that probably cost more than Lena's rent, charcoal wool, perfectly fitted across shoulders that belonged in a different century. She bounced off him and would have gone down on the wet sidewalk if his hand hadn't caught her arm. Fast. Reflexive. The grip was controlled in a way that normal people's reflexes weren't. "Sorry," she said, automatically pulling back. He looked at her. He had the kind of face that had probably been striking once, before whatever had happened to it. A jaw that was more scar tissue than jawline on the left side, a nose that had been broken at least twice, dark eyes that didn't do anything she recognized as a normal social response to walking into a stranger. He just looked at her, like he was running a calculation. "You're bleeding," he said. Lena looked down. Her palm was scraped from catching herself on the building facade. A thin line of red, not serious. "I'm fine. You walked into me looking at the ground. You were walking the wrong direction on a one-way sidewalk." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, more like recognition. He let go of her arm. "Kieran," said one of the 2 men behind him. She hadn't registered them, which told her something about how distracted she'd been. "We're late." The man named Kieran didn't look at the man who had spoken. He was still looking at Lena with that calculating expression, like she was a figure in a ledger that didn't add up. "What happened?" he asked. Lena blinked. "I told you, I wasn't watching where." "Not that." He meant something else. He had somehow in 30 seconds clocked the tote bag, the cardigan balled up on top, the fact that her work lanyard was still around her neck, but the badge was turned face down in a particular way people only did when they'd just been told to hand it back in. "I got laid off," she said, because there was no point lying about something that obvious. "Today, about 15 minutes ago. What do you do?" "Accounting." "What kind?" She stared at him. "What kind of forensic tax? Audit? What kind of accounting? Forensic, mostly. I find. She stopped, because this was a very strange conversation to be having on a sidewalk in November, with a man whose name was apparently Kieran, and who had two silent men standing 6 feet behind him like furniture. I find discrepancies, money that moved in directions it wasn't supposed to move. I trace it. The calculating look sharpened into something else, something more deliberate. Kieran, said the man behind him again. Get the car, Kieran said, without turning. Then, to Lena, have dinner with me. She laughed. It came out before she could decide whether it was appropriate. No, it's not a social invitation. What is it then? A business conversation. He glanced at the tote bag again, with someone who might be useful and who appears to currently have the time. The specific humiliation of that, of someone reading her financial desperation that clearly, that quickly, and saying it out loud on a public sidewalk, made something in Lena's chest go flat and cold and stubborn. She had spent 11 months being useful to people who never said so. She had spent her entire adult life being the person who figured things out for institutions that discarded her the moment something more convenient came along. I don't know who you are, she said. Kieran Voss, he said, in a tone that suggested this was information most people already had. It wasn't information she already had. The name meant nothing to her. But the way he said it, flat, unapologetic, like a door code, made her understand it was supposed to. Lena Vasquez, she said, matching his tone exactly. Something happened at the corner of his mouth, almost a reaction. I know, he said. She didn't ask how the car had pulled up to the curb, black, long, the kind of vehicle that didn't have a brand logo anywhere visible. One of the silent men opened the rear door. Lena looked at the open door. She looked at Kieran Voss, who was watching her with the patience of someone who was very rarely told no, and had decided not to deploy any particular charm about it. Just wait. She thought about the $214, the 9 days until rent. The second interview that might not become anything. She thought about the notepad in her tote bag, full of figures from a project that had been taken away from her before she'd finished it, because someone had decided she wasn't permanent enough to see it through. She got in the car. The restaurant was the kind of place that didn't have prices on the menu. Lena had been to exactly one place like this in her life. At a work dinner she'd been invited to by mistake, when someone with a similar last name couldn't make it. She'd ordered the second least expensive thing on the menu and spent the whole meal calculating what everyone else was spending. Kieran Voss ordered water and something she didn't catch in a language she didn't speak, and the waiter disappeared immediately and efficiently. You worked at Aldgate and Fitch for 11 months, Voss said. You had me looked up, in the car. Yes, that's... She started to say invasive and stopped, because she'd gotten into a stranger's car, which made invasive a complicated complaint. What did you find? That you're very good at your job, and that they knew it, which is why they kept you as a temp for 11 months instead of hiring you permanently. He said this the way he seemed to say most things, directly, without softening it, like facts were facts, and there was no point dressing them. It's cheaper to discard a temp. I know why they did it. I'm sure you do. Is that why you stopped? Because I worked at. I stopped because you walked into me while looking at the ground and argued with me about sidewalk direction while bleeding from your hand. He looked at her across the table. Most people don't argue with me. Lena picked up her water glass. Most people probably know who you are. And now you do. I know your name. That's not the same thing. He studied her. She held still under it, the way she'd learned to hold still in rooms where people were deciding whether she mattered. She'd gotten good at it. Good at not flinching, not filling the silence, not performing whatever it was people wanted her to perform to make them comfortable. I have a problem, Voss said finally. Most people who bring strangers to expensive restaurants do. Someone has been taking money from my organization for approximately 18 months. Not large amounts. Small, consistent ones, moved through accounts that are technically legitimate, timed specifically to avoid pattern detection. He paused. My people haven't found it. The firm I hired hasn't found it. The firm I hired before that firm didn't find it either. Lena set down her glass. What kind of organization? The kind where this conversation doesn't leave this table. She absorbed that. The two men from the sidewalk were at a table near the door. Not eating, not drinking, just present. The restaurant had other diners, but there was a perimeter of empty tables around theirs, in a way that suggested it hadn't happened by accident. You're asking me to do forensic accounting for? She stopped, recalibrated. You're asking me to find money that someone is stealing from you? Yes, without knowing where it's going or how many accounts are involved. Yes, that could take months. I'm aware. And I'd need access to financials that I assume are not the kind of thing you share with people you met on a sidewalk 20 minutes ago. Which is why there would be a contract, Voss said, and compensation structured to reflect the access being granted and the discretion being required. Lena looked at him. He looked back at her. The calculation in his eyes was different now, still assessing, but waiting on something, a specific response. She had the strange feeling that most people, when Kieran Voss presented them with an offer, said yes immediately, and that he was genuinely curious which way she was going to go. "What's the compensation?" she asked. He named a number. Lena kept her face very still. The number was not something she would have believed if someone had said it to her this morning when she was sitting at her wobbling desk at Aldgate and Fitch. The number was rent for 2 years and then some. The number was the kind of number that changed the shape of a problem. "For how long?" she said. "As long as it takes, with a 6-month minimum guarantee, and if I find it in 3 months. The guarantee stands, and if I can't find it..." Something crossed his face, not doubt. "You'll find it. You don't know that. I know that the 3 firms before you had more resources and less motivation." He glanced at her hand, still faintly marked from the scrape. "You're motivated." The word landed like something small and sharp. Not cruel, accurate. She hated that it was accurate. "I want the contract reviewed by someone I choose," she said. "Reasonable. And I want..." She stopped because she hadn't thought further than that, because she hadn't let herself think further than that. "I need to know what I'm walking into, what the organization is, what the risks look like." Voss was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was carefully. "The risks are not to you. They are around you. There's a difference. That distinction matters a lot to me. I expect it does." He leaned back slightly, just a fraction. "What I can tell you is that whoever is taking from me has been doing it for 18 months, without discovery. That tells me they understand my systems from the inside. That makes them dangerous to me." He looked at her directly. "Not to you. You'd be brought in as a financial consultant. Nothing else. And the people who work for you. Do they know? No one would know what you're looking for. As far as my organization is concerned, you would be doing a routine audit contracted from outside." Lena thought about this for a long moment. She thought about the envelope on the wobbling desk. She thought about effective immediately and 2 weeks severance, and the woman at the front desk who hadn't looked up. She thought about the notepad full of figures she hadn't been allowed to finish. "I want to see the contract tonight," she said. Voss reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed a folded document on the table between them. Lena looked at it. She looked at him. "I had it ready," he confirmed. "Before I said yes. Before you said yes." She picked up the contract and started reading. He ordered food she hadn't asked for, but turned out to be exactly what she would have chosen, which she decided not to think about. She read every line. She ate without looking up. At one point she found a clause that needed revision and said so, and Voss called someone on his phone and dictated a change without argument. She signed it at 10:47 p.m. at a table in a restaurant she never would have walked into on her own, with a pen that had been produced from somewhere and probably cost more than her cardigan. "You start Monday," Voss said. "I know. I signed the contract. Someone will send you the access credentials tonight. I'll need the full ledger history for the last 24 months, not 18, and I'll need it sorted by account origin, not date." He looked at her for a moment. "Why 24? Because if someone's been doing this for 18 months, they weren't practicing for 0 months before that. They were practicing somewhere. I want to see the months before the pattern started." Voss was very still. The three other firms didn't ask for that. Then they were looking at the problem wrong. He picked up his water glass. Something in the set of his jaw shifted. Not quite approval. Not quite anything she had a word for. Like a door being opened a specific controlled amount. "Monday," he said again. "Monday," she agreed. The office they gave her was on the 14th floor of a building in the financial district that didn't have a lobby sign and required a keycard she hadn't been issued until she was physically present and fingerprinted. The room was small and clean and had a window that looked at a wall and a computer that was the most powerful machine she'd ever touched, and a phone that she was told would be answered by exactly one person. There were no other employees in the immediate vicinity. This was intentional. She understood without being told that the distance was a form of protection. For her, from them, in both directions. She started with the 24 months of records and felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, that specific sensation of something clicking into place behind her sternum. The thing that happened when a set of numbers started to have a shape. The shape was patient, whatever it was. Patient and small and consistent, the way water is when it's working on something hard. She spent the first week just looking, not touching anything, not marking anything, building a map in her head of the way money moved through the organization's legitimate structures. The payroll, the property holdings, the contracted services. It was, she had to admit, an extraordinarily clean set of books for an operation that she was increasingly certain existed on multiple sides of multiple legal lines. Whoever maintained these books was good. Whoever was stealing from them was better. She found the first thread on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks in a column of contractor invoices that repeated at intervals that looked random, but weren't, if you converted the amounts to a base 7 numerical pattern instead of base 10. It was the kind of thing you wouldn't see unless you were specifically not looking at the obvious. She sat very still for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called the one number she had. "I need to see Voss," she said. "Mr. Voss is unavailable until—" "Tell him I found the thread," Lena said. "He'll know what that means." There was a pause. "Hold, please." She held for 40 seconds. "He'll see you at 7, the voice said. She had seen Voss 3 times in the 3 weeks she'd worked for him. Once on her first day, briefly, when he had come to the 14th floor and looked at her setup and asked 2 questions and left. Once at the end of the 2nd week, when a man she didn't recognize had appeared at her door and said she should take a car home because there had been a situation in the building and it was better to clear non-essential personnel, which told her everything she needed to know about what the situation was. And once, accidentally, when she had gone to find a printer and found instead a hallway where Voss was speaking quietly with a man whose posture made every alarm she owned quietly fire, and Voss had clocked her presence without turning his head, and the conversation had simply stopped. She had gone back to her office. She had not asked about it. She was good at understanding which things were not hers to ask about. The 7 o'clock meeting was in a room she hadn't been to before, on a floor that required a different keycard, which the phone voice had told her would be loaded to her existing card by the time she arrived. It was. The room was not what she expected. It was almost sparse for someone she suspected owned most of the building. A long table, a window with a view of the harbor, city lights in the water below. Voss was standing at the window when she came in. He turned when he heard the door. She put the printed documentation on the table. He came and looked at it. She stood beside him and walked him through it, and she watched the specific kind of attention he gave to numbers. Not the glaze-over she was used to from most people when she started explaining forensic accounting mechanics, but something focused and engaged and, she thought, already running the implications before she'd finished stating them. "Base 7 conversion," he said when she got to that part. "It wouldn't appear in any standard audit algorithm. Most software checks for repeating patterns in base 10. Who would know to do that? Someone who expected the books to be audited," Lena said. "Someone who expected a standard algorithmic sweep. This was designed specifically to survive one." Voss was quiet. She could see the muscle in his jaw working slowly, the scar on the left side of his face pulling slightly with it. "How long to trace it back?" he asked. "I have the thread now. 3 days, maybe 4. Depends on how many relay accounts they used. And you'll know who, I'll know where the money went. That usually leads to who." He turned and looked at her in the way he had on the sidewalk, the first day, like she was a figure in a ledger that didn't balance. Except now the look was different, less assessing and more concluded, like the calculation was finished and he'd arrived somewhere. "You should be careful," he said. "I'm always careful, more careful than you have been." He said it without inflection, but something in it was not casual. If someone inside this organization constructed something this precise, they've been watching the audit process. They may be watching this process. Lena absorbed that. "You think they know someone new is looking?" "I think they're methodical. Methodical people watch for changes in their environment." He picked up one of her printed pages and looked at it for a moment. "You found something 3 other firms didn't find in a combined 8 months of looking. That means you either got lucky or you're thinking about this differently than they were." He set the page down. "I don't think it was luck." She didn't say anything, which means, Voss continued, that if they're paying attention, they've registered a change. Be aware of that. Lena looked at the harbor lights in the water below the window. She thought about being aware of things. She'd been aware of things her whole life. The awareness you developed when you didn't have a safety net, when you'd learned early that no one was going to catch you if you missed a step, so you learned to see the steps. "I'm not afraid of whoever this is," she said. "I didn't say to be afraid. I said to be careful. Those are different things." She looked at him. He looked at her. In the harbor light, the scar on his jaw was more visible, a raised ridge of old damage that had healed the way things heal when there's no time to heal properly. "You found this in 3 weeks, Voss said. "The others had 8 months. They were looking at the problem wrong. So you said," a pause. "What were they doing wrong?" "They were looking for patterns that broke the rules. I looked for patterns that followed the rules too perfectly. Real accounting has noise. Small human errors, rounding inconsistencies, timing variations. This set of books doesn't have any of that. It's too clean." She met his eyes. "No one's books are that clean unless someone is trying very hard to make them look that way." Voss was still for a moment. "Then, what made you think to look for that? Because when I'm trying to hide something in a column of numbers," Lena said, "I make sure it's very, very clean." The room was quiet. Outside, the city moved the way cities do at night, unconcerned, enormous, full of its own transactions. 3 days, Voss said. "Maybe 4. I'll have 2 of my people stationed on your floor, starting tomorrow morning." I know you don't need them," he said. "They're there so whoever is watching knows they'd be dealing with more than you." She thought about arguing. She thought about the specific weight of being protected by someone who hadn't asked what she wanted first, and how that should have made her angry, and how it did a little in the way of something you knew was probably right, even if you hadn't chosen it. "Fine," she said. She gathered her documents. At the door she stopped. "Voss!" He looked at her. "The thread goes back 26 months, she said. "Not 18. I thought you should know." She didn't look at his face when she said it, but she heard him. A very slight exhalation, the kind that comes when something you suspected turns out to be true and you still didn't want it to be. "Good night, Vasquez," he said. "Good night," she said, and walked back out into the building that didn't have a lobby sign, and took the elevator down to the street, and stood for a moment in the November cold, with the feeling of a thread in her hands for the first time in as long as she could remember. Not her problem to solve, except that she was going to solve it anyway. She always did. The car Voss had arranged without asking pulled to the curb. She got in. The city moved past the windows, enormous and uninterested, and Lena Vasquez sat in the dark and thought about the 26 months of someone's careful, patient dishonesty, and the way a thing had to be built to last, and how the same precision that had hidden it for 2 years was now, because of her, going to be what unraveled it. She thought about that all the way home. She thought also, very briefly, in the space between one streetlight and the next, About the way Voss had said, "Be careful," in a room full of harbor light, like the word cost him something to say out loud. She decided not to think about that. She was very good at deciding not to think about things. She looked at the city going past the window and thought about numbers instead, about the pattern that was already dismantling itself inside her head. And she thought, 3 days. 3 days, and she would know. Whatever happened after that was a different kind of problem. And she was very good at problems.